is January 1945, a frozen field hospital near Arles, Belgium. Inside a canvas tent, a young American soldier lies shivering on a blood-stained cot, his breathing shallow and rattling. He is holding a small, silver rosary in his trembling hand. He whispers a final, desperate request for a priest to hear his confession and administer the last rites before his eyes close forever. Outside, the wind howls through the pine trees, but the only chaplain available, a man who wears the cross of peace on his collar, flatly refuses to step inside. He says he does not serve colored personnel and demands the staff find a colored chaplain instead. There is no other chaplain for 50 miles. The boy dies in the freezing dark, his final sacrament denied. But George Patton is about to discover this silent betrayal, and his response will echo through the ranks. This is the story of an army priest who gave Holy Communion to captured German enemies, but left a dying American soldier to perish without his final sacrament, and how George Patton forced him to face the mirror. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the moments that forced people to face what they'd done. Private First Class Arthur Simmons was 20 years old. He came from the warm, humid streets of New Orleans, Louisiana, where the bells of St. Louis Cathedral had mapped the rhythm of his Sunday mornings. He belonged to the Quartermaster Corps, hauling fuel and ammunition up to the freezing front lines through roads slick with black ice. He was a devout Catholic, a boy who carried his faith like a shield in a pocket close to his heart. His mother's last letter, folded tightly in his wool coat, contained a single, urgent plea to stay close to God. He had done exactly that, even as the artillery tore the winter sky apart. Now, he lay on a canvas cot, his chest torn by shrapnel, his life slipping away in the freezing mud of Belgium. Captain Father William McGuire was 45 years old. A Catholic chaplain from Boston, Massachusetts, he was a man of precise habits and deep-seated prejudices. He wore a clean, tailored uniform, his brass insignia polished to a high gleam. He had spent his military career ministering to white soldiers, never once hesitating to offer comfort, confession, or the final sacrament to those in agony. He had even crossed the barbed wire of the stockades to give last rites to 3 dying German prisoners of war earlier that very week. To McGuire, the rituals of his faith were sacred, but only when applied within the boundaries of his own worldview. He drew a hard, unyielding line at the black Americans serving in his own army, viewing them not as souls in need of salvation, but as an unwanted intrusion into his orderly sanctuary. The Ardennes offensive was screaming toward its bloody climax. The German winter counter-offensive had caught the Allies off guard, turning the dense forests of Belgium and Luxembourg into a frozen slaughterhouse. Thousands of wounded men flooded the backlines daily. Field hospitals were overwhelmed, operating under flickering lanterns while the snow piled high against the canvas walls. Doctors worked until their hands froze, and nurses moved through the rows of cots like ghosts in the dim light. In this chaos of blood and ice, the normal structures of military life began to splinter, with supply lines broken and divisions scattered. Many officers and commanders looked the other way when it came to systemic neglect. Segregation was the law of the United States military, but the desperate need for manpower on the front lines forced black and white soldiers into the same frozen mud. Yet, behind the lines, the old barriers remained fiercely guarded. Many white officers, chaplains, and doctors treated black service troops as invisible laborers, denying them the basic dignities of care, comfort, and respect. It was a silent, ugly compromise that most in high command chose to ignore, focusing instead on the maps and the advancing German armor. But in the crowded ward at Arlon, the invisible line had finally been crossed, and the silent compromise was about to shatter. Second Lieutenant Alma Richardson was 24 years old. She was an Army Nurse Corps officer from Baltimore, Maryland, who had seen enough torn flesh in the last 6 weeks to last 3 lifetimes. She stood over the cot of Private Simmons, watching the gray shadow of death creep across his young face. She stepped out of the ward, her boots crunching on the frozen crust of snow, and hurried to the chaplain's tent. She found Captain McGuire sitting near a small kerosene stove, cup of hot coffee in his hand. "Chaplain," she said, her voice tight. "I have a boy dying in Ward 3. He is Catholic. He is asking for his last rites." McGuire did not look up from his metal cup. "Which unit is he with, Lieutenant?" "The 388th Quartermaster," she replied. "His name is Private Simmons. He does not have much time left." The chaplain set his cup down on the wooden crate. The 388th is a colored unit, Lieutenant. You know the regulations regarding separate facilities. He is dying. Father, she said, her voice rising slightly. There is no other priest. Then you must locate a colored chaplain for him, McGuire answered, his voice flat and untroubled. I do not serve colored personnel. It is not my assignment. There is no colored chaplain within 50 miles of this sector, she said. The roads are blocked with snow. He will not survive the night. He is an American soldier, chaplain. He deserves his sacrament. McGuire stood up, smoothing the front of his clean wool jacket. His eyes went cold. Every man has his place in this army, Lieutenant. I minister to the men of my own flock. I will not cross that line. Run along and find him someone else. He is asking for God, Father, not a white man, she said. That is enough, Lieutenant, McGuire snapped. You are out of line. I have work to do. I gave confession to 3 German prisoners this afternoon in the stockade. They are baptized Catholics. My duties are clear. I will not be lectured by a nurse. Lieutenant Richardson stared at him, her hands balled into tight fists. She did not speak another word. She turned on her heel and walked back into the freezing wind. She returned to Ward 3, took Private Simmons's cold, damp hand in her own, and sat on the edge of the cot. She did not find a priest. Instead, she opened a small pocket Bible and read the 23rd Psalm aloud, her voice steady against the howling wind outside, holding his hand until the last beat of his heart stopped. The next morning, she bypassed her immediate supervisor and typed a detailed 2-page report of the incident. She marked it urgent and sent it straight up the chain of command. The report reached Patton's desk within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the field hospital gate. 4 stars on his helmet, ivory revolvers on his belt. The heavy tires ground the frozen gravel into powder as the general stepped out, his face a mask of cold fury. He did not wait for an escort. He walked into the administrative tent unannounced. Captain McGuire stood at his desk, his hand rising to a stiff, nervous salute. The general did not return it. Patton studied him for a long, silent moment. The only sound in the tent was the low hiss of the kerosene heater. Captain, Patton said, his voice quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. Did you refuse to administer the last rites to Private Arthur Simmons of the Quartermaster Corps? McGuire swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the floor before returning to Patton. General, there are specific administrative guidelines for the Chaplain Corps regarding separate assignments. I was adhering to established division protocol. Did you refuse the boy? Patton asked again, his voice dropping an octave. He was colored, General, McGuire said, his voice tightening. I am a Boston priest. I do not minister to colored troops. I instructed the nurse to find a suitable chaplain of his own race. Patton stepped closer. And did you minister to the German prisoners in the stockade this week? Yes, sir, McGuire answered, drawing himself up slightly. They are baptized Catholics. As a priest, it is my duty to save souls, even those of the enemy. Patton's eyes narrowed. So, a German who came across the ocean to kill American boys is worthy of your prayers, but an American soldier wearing our uniform is not. General, you must understand the ecclesiastical hierarchy, McGuire began, his voice rising in panic. Silence. Patton said, You wear a cross on your collar, Captain, but you do not know the first thing about the God you claim to serve. God does not check skin color at the gates of heaven, and he certainly does not check division protocol. You chose to comfort the men who pulled the triggers, and you chose to abandon the boy who hauled the ammunition that kept this army alive. You allowed an American soldier to die in the dark, like a dog, because you were too proud to touch his hand. McGuire stood frozen, his face draining of color. You have a choice, Patton said, his voice deadly calm. You will write a personal letter to Private Simmons's mother. You will explain to her, in your own words, exactly why her son died without his sacrament, because you were too holy to give it to him. Or you will face a general court-martial for neglect of duty in the face of the enemy. Decide now. I will write the letter, General, McGuire whispered. You will, Patton said, and when you are finished, you are transferred. You seemed more comfortable ministering to the enemy. From this hour on, you are the exclusive chaplain for the German POB enclosure. Do that until this war is won. Either way, this ends today. The transfer was executed before the snow began to fall again that afternoon. 2 military policemen escorted Captain McGuire to the barbed wire perimeter of the German prisoner stockade near Arlon. The wind whipped through the enclosure, carrying the smell of wood smoke, wet wool, and damp earth, under the watchful eyes of the guards and the silent, staring gazes of hundreds of captured German soldiers. McGuire sat at a rough wooden crate in a drafty guard shack. His hands trembled as he held a fountain pen over a blank sheet of paper, forced to write the truth of his cowardice to a mother in New Orleans. The guards stood over him, refusing to let him rise until every word was written. Outside, the American staff at the hospital watched the disgraced priest walk into the muddy compound, stripped of his authority over American souls, by order of the Third Army. A new chaplain arrived at the ward before nightfall with explicit instructions from Patton himself that every soldier, regardless of the color of his skin, would receive the full measure of spiritual care. Nurse Alma Richardson returned to Baltimore, Maryland, after the war. She married a local high school teacher, raised 3 children, and worked as a pediatric nurse for nearly 30 years. She never spoke of the freezing winter in Belgium to her neighbors, but she kept a small, tarnished silver rosary in her dresser drawer until the day she died in 1989. Her daughter later found the rosary wrapped in a yellowed newspaper, clipping about the Third Army's advance. William McGuire remained in Germany after the German surrender, serving out his assignment in the bleak prisoner camps of the American Zone. He was quietly discharged from the Army in late 1946 and returned to Massachusetts. He spent the remainder of his life in a small, isolated parish in western Massachusetts, never rising above the rank of assistant pastor. He lived a quiet, bitter life, rarely speaking to his fellow priests, and died in 1974. General George Patton never mentioned the incident in his personal diaries or his post-war memoirs. The 2-page report written by Nurse Richardson remained in a mislabeled file cabinet in the Third Army archives, undiscovered for decades. Yet, in a letter to his wife Beatrice, written in late January 1945, Patton noted that there were no small battles when it came to a commander's honor, writing that a man who cannot respect the dead has no right to lead the living. Some historians have argued that Patton's intervention was less about racial equality and more about maintaining absolute military discipline and order within his ranks. They suggest that any breach of duty, especially one that threatened the morale of support troops during a critical offensive, was intolerable to a commander who demanded perfection. Others have argued the opposite, pointing to the incident as proof that Patton possessed a practical, blunt sense of justice that transcended the systemic prejudices of his era. What is certain is that the official records of the Third Army show a marked shift in chaplain assignments in the Ardennes sector during the final months of the war, ensuring that no American soldier was ever again denied spiritual comfort in his final hour. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have quietly reassigned the chaplain without a public confrontation? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the moments that forced people to face what they'd done, make sure to subscribe.